I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's online discussion, Crossroads of Democracy, Student Protests, and the 2024 US presidential election. We will be joined in this Zoom by three distinguished guests: Theo Baker, Nicholas Christakis, and Laura Silver. Now, as everyone on this Zoom will know, university and college campuses across the United States were rocked with the most dramatic demonstrations since the Vietnam War era. The central issues at stake had to do with Hamas's devastating attack on Israeli towns and villages and a music festival in southern Israel, and perhaps even more saliently with Israel's campaign against Hamas in the months that followed, a campaign that continues to this day and is said to have left, depending on who is talking, between 20,000 and more than 40,000 people dead. Today, we'll discuss what it was like to live on a university campus during these demonstrations, why the demonstrations have spread like wildfire, at least across one segment of American universities, as well as the light that they have cast on America's institutions of higher education, which have long been seen as jewels of American society. We will also examine the question of whether the demonstrations and the opposition to the Biden administration's policy that they betoken toward Israel and Gaza could have a significant effect on the November presidential elections. Just to give you a little background on this series of events, this is one event in the Road to the U.S. Election series, which is running or has been running since January 2024 and will continue through the inauguration in January 2025. It has the goal of bringing in-depth discussions and fostering a vibrant exchange of ideas in the lead up to the U.S. Election in November and then beyond. The series is a collaboration of over 25 transatlantic organizations and political foundations on both sides of the Atlantic. It aims to engage in dynamic dialogues and to provide a variety of perspectives on this election, to offer comprehensive insights for audiences in the United States, Germany, and beyond. So let me introduce our three guests. First, Theo Baker is a university student and a journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, New York Magazine, the Chicago Tribune, and elsewhere. I think it's safe to say, Theo, you are now a rising junior. Is that correct? Having just finished your sophomore year?
That's the hope.
That's what they call you, huh? And so he is at Stanford University, and Theo, you could say, was out of the blocks fast. He is the youngest ever recipient of a George Polk Award, one of the highest, most well-known awards in American journalism. And he received that for the in-depth reporting that he published in the Stanford Daily that resulted in the resignation of Stanford's president, as well as the retraction of a number of high-profile scientific studies. Nicholas Christakis is the Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University. His work is in the fields of network science and biosocial science. He directs the Human Nature Lab and is the co-director of the Yale Institute for Network Science. His current work focuses on how human biology and health are affected by social interactions, social networks. He is the author of more than 220 articles, which is somewhat staggering, and several books. His most recent book is Blueprint: The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, which came out in 2029. I'm correct, Nicholas, that is the most recent book. You haven't slipped one in.
That was 2019. I had a book on the pandemic in 2020 called Apollo's Arrow.
I knew that I would get that wrong, so I'm glad I asked. He is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the National Academy of Sciences. Perhaps equally important for our purposes, he was a distinguished visitor at the American Academy in 2019. Laura Silver is an associate director at the Pew Research Center. She specializes in international survey research, and she writes about a variety of topics and is also involved in all aspects of the quantitative research process and survey design. Prior to Pew, she was a foreign affairs research analyst at the U.S. Department of State in the Office of Opinion Research. Her work has been published in the International Journal of Public Opinion Research and International Studies Quarterly, among other places. And she routinely appears on in such media as New York Times, The Washington Post, CNN, BBC, Deutsche Welle, among others. I should say that Laura is coming to us from Wilmington, Vermont. Nicholas is coming to us from the wonderful village of Norwich, Vermont. And Theo is coming to us from Northern California. So I don't think the Vermont concentration signifies any narrowing of views. And I'm delighted to welcome you all. Just as a matter of housekeeping, I'm going to ask our guests to make some extended observations on the topics at hand. And after that, we'll have a bit of discussion. Please do start sending in your questions just as early as you like. Please type it in the Q&A part of the Zoom platform. And with that, I suggest we get going. So Theo, your piece in The Atlantic about your experience was riveting and got, I think, probably a gazillion eyeballs after it was published. Congratulations on that. But why don't you tell us what it was like to be, are you 19, 20, and a Jewish undergraduate in a campus that was in complete upheaval?
Well, I am 19. Thank you for having me and allowing me to be the token student among such a distinguished crowd. I'll try not to return the favor by being too down, but yeah, the truth is things have been pretty mired in dogma since the start, or at least since October 7th. Pretty much right after the initial attack, flags started going up all across Stanford that said the illusion of Israel is burning, that we're celebrating the attacks. Within a week, you couldn't get into some parties at Stanford unless you said "fuck Israel" at the door. There's a literal requirement to get in. That's according to some of my reporting that went into the Atlantic article. Some of the more notable incidents also happened earlier in that week. Just 3 days after October 7th, a lecturer in a class for freshmen separated out all of the Jews, called them colonizers, told one to sit in the corner, took his stuff, and called that a representation of what the Israelis had done to the Palestinians and justified what Hamas had done to Israel. So really right from the start, there were sort of indicators that this was not going to go all that well. And of course, the months since have not gotten all that much better. The problem as I see it is not one necessarily of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, although these are deep problems. And actually, between us, the reports on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia from the university should be coming out later today. And have some pretty shocking details of the incidents that have been taking place on campus. But the truth is, by far the most concerning element of this to me is not to do with any individual prejudice. It's how we treat each other. The fact of the matter is that the vast majority of these protesters are not particularly invested in the protests that they're engaging with. And that leads to a situation where a lot of people are speaking far beyond their bounds. They're saying things they don't necessarily understand. They're, ascribing moral righteousness to beliefs that actually, if carried out, would result in the mass slaughter of, Jews, would result in the destruction of Israel. They advocate very willingly for the destruction of Israel. But the problem is that, the more Stanford and universities like it have created environments that prioritize their own excellence, and they have. That prioritize their own exclusivity, and they have. the less they prioritize institutions and people within them who are willing to accept uncertainty, who are willing to accept anything less than full correctness. And that's really the issue that has come to the fore in the last few months, is that you're not allowed to not know. And yet most people still don't know. So that leads to a situation where the vast majority of campus has been sort of enmeshed in, conflicts that they don't actually fully get. After all, this is a conflict that has been going on for centuries and centuries. I opened my piece with the anecdote of my TA telling me that Biden should be killed, which, to the outside world
You're
was
teaching
really
assistant for those on this side of the Atlantic who aren't familiar with it. Yeah.
Yeah, so this guy was a master's student who serves as a teaching assistant. So this was a big computer science course, which meant that we had lectures from a professor, and then we would go and have like labs or smaller sections. It was taught by a TA. In this case, this was my TA, and my TA, 23-year-old, married, as it turns out. Told me to my face that Biden should be killed and that Hamas would actually be better at running America. And to most of the sane world, that is kind of breathtaking. And yet at Stanford, honestly, it didn't feel that remarkable, which was why I used it as a lead. The truth is, my piece, I tried not to make it about any one of the individual incidents. Every group, no matter what group it is going to have some proportion of crazy people in it. That's just kind of the nature of groups. And of course, if you have one side that is so much more dominant, as the pro-Palestinian side is so much larger in numbers, then it makes sense that you're going to have a larger number of people who are crazy, even if the proportion is the same. So it's not about any of the individual events. It's about how we as a collective tolerate them. It's about how those are normalized. It's about how normal people can accept the people who are pushing the bounds as their allies. I wrote about an incident that I witnessed that to me was very disturbing, actually, both as a student and as a Jew. It was leaving an anti-Semitism event. That was the event. It had nothing to do with Israel. Except for the fact that one of the panelists was Israeli. And immediately after, the people who attended the panel, so not the panelists, these are just people who were in the audience for a panel about ameliorating anti-Semitism, were told to go back to Brooklyn, to get the fuck off of our campus. They were told that one of the protesters who surrounded the mostly Jewish audience told them that you will all be replaced and we will take your places. Which I can't imagine hearing. I couldn't have imagined coming to college to hear something like that. It's just so anathema to how these colleges portray themselves, as bastions of intellectual disagreement, as welcoming homes. I mean, literally, this was happening underneath and lit by a streetlight that had a welcome home banner on it. The irony of Jews standing around under a welcome home banner while being told, that they were kikes is not lost on me. And the fact that all of this has happened over the last few months is obviously a running tide of not just anti-Semitism, but anti-intellectual thought, unwillingness to engage with complexity and nuance that, of course, my fellow panelists here have a lot more knowledge of, have been tracking for a long time. But just as a student, it's been a really weird time to be on campus for the last, whatever it was, 9 months. And the truth is, this issue may pass. This particular, conflict in Israel and Gaza may abate. The issues in America, the issues with our colleges, the issues with how we accept, each other's treatment, those are not going away. Those are going to get worse. And those are really threatening for American democracy and I guess for the rest of the world.
Well, that's incredible. And I do recommend that everyone read Theo's piece in The Atlantic. What was it titled again? I went to college.
I think the title was War at Stanford. Yeah.
Right. So one of the problems that people away from college campuses, and particularly in Europe, have been challenged by is the question of, how encompassing these protests were. Now, I have a lot of friends who teach at American universities, and I would check in with them and I would get back, the usual email was, it's pretty serious, but most of the college or most of the university is still doing its thing. And I'm curious if that was your impression as well, and if among your friends there was just a kind of let's just get through this and let's ignore the what's going on at the margins of campus society. But how did it feel to you?
Yeah, I think, even if the protests are by nature marginal, as most protests are, it's the attitude that to me is a lot more interesting. And the attitude it permeates everything. I really don't know any Jew or Muslim on campus who has not been like really torn up over this. Um, you know, I think it says something to people to watch their peers behave in a way that is unaccepting of them as people. And that is something that we have witnessed time and again, where rhetoric has become so uncompromising that it is, fundamentally goes into discriminatory rhetoric.
No.
And to have large swaths of the campus, even if they are not your swaths, participating in what you believe to be discriminatory rhetoric against your group obviously takes a psychological toll. Especially, the thing to remember is that we're all still kids. We're very much still kids, which helps explain some of the idiocy we see, but it also helps explain why a lot of people are having trouble fitting in. And there's a almost unique burden on Jewish students to disavow Israel, or to not be associated with Israel. I mean, I've seen a ton of people post things like, this is, why are you guys doing this? And the truth is that's the Jewish identity is now on campus so interlinked with Israel, and Israel is treated as such an, unambiguous bad guy that it is pretty hard to exist apolitically,
Right.
on campus.
Nicholas, does this resemble what you were seeing at Yale?
Yeah, I would like to affiliate myself with pretty much everything Theo said. I mean, I think his analysis and description is, at least to my perspective, quite cogent. I would just accent a couple things, pick up on one thing you said, and then a few things that Theo said to just keep the conversation going. First of all, I think you, Dan, said that these universities are typically seen as the jewels of our society, and they are in many ways. They, first of all, reflect our wealth to create institutions of this kind and set aside the resources that are required to, put a faculty and a group of young people, sequester them for prolonged periods of time is enormous, that wealth that's required for that. But they also reflect our values. They, in many ways, instantiate Enlightenment values of reason and debate and free expression. And they are, to my eye, hallmarks of our civilization, and they deserve to be cherished and nourished, in my view, and protected from political attacks. The problem is the institutions, in my view, many of our elite institutions have lost their way. They have meandered from their fundamental mission, which mission I regard to be the preservation, production, and dissemination of knowledge. That's the core mission of a university. And that mission, I think, can be relatively apolitical. But the universities have made themselves into political actors, and therefore, in a number of ways, including recruiting students who are very committed to explicitly committed. I mean, young people are always political, and that's great and terrific, and often drivers of progressive and righteous change in our society. But there's also this crazy conflation that's taking place right now where people are saying, well, you want to be with the students because you want to be on the wrong side of history. But, the students were also, Red Guards, and they were Pol Pot's, army. and they were, brown shirts during Nazi Germany. I mean, young people can be whipped into a frenzy. Just because young people are articulating something doesn't mean it's true and moral. And so there's this, anyway, so we recruit, young people are intrinsically prone to this. We recruit now students and tell them that universities are not so much places of the discovery of knowledge, but places of activism. And I think that contributes to whipping them into a frenzy and also alienating ourselves from what I regard to be the fundamental mission of a university. Furthermore, we have a kind of a development. I mean, this has always been the case, for thousands of years, that human beings crave a kind of simplifying ideology, which used to be in the form of religion. Obey these rules and you'll go to heaven. This is the way to have a holy life, for example. These are the principles under which you should live, and you don't need to think about it. Just follow these rules. But now we have these sort of simplifying ideologies that are very ascendant on campus, and Theo alluded to, and sort of split people into the oppressed and the oppressors, sort of abandon nuance. And I'm shocked to discover the extent to which many students at our universities are happy to adopt that kind of perspective instead of actually being committed to nuance and reason and debate and struggling with difficult ideas. They are quite relieved and happy to just embrace a sort of totalizing ideology that sort of lets them off the hook. Let's not forget that one of the hallmarks of authoritarian regimes is not so much the truths they prohibit you from saying, but the lies they require you to say, right? I can show my tremendous control over you by forcing you to say things which are manifestly false. And that's how you demonstrate that you're part of the cult. And I think we're seeing those elements on our campuses as well today, where people are sort of, repeat the catechism and just say things that, aren't actually correct, but they feel compelled to say it. So anyway, I think that there are a number of ways that our universities have lost their way, and I think that is intersecting with these sort of reascendance of antisemitism, a kind of simplification of political discussions, and a way in which the university, having lost its way, now is rightfully seen as a political actor, and therefore rightfully seen as an appropriate target for political attacks, which I think is what has gotten the universities into tremendous trouble with the United States Congress. They could hardly represent themselves as, leave us alone. We're just engaged in the pursuit of knowledge, because that, hasn't been the case.
So let me ask you, I confess that I wanted Nicholas to be on this show because so many of the comments he's made on Twitter, otherwise known as X, I found so interesting. And one of the questions that arose from my reading of your comments, and you're probably horrified that this is the point of departure, but
I can't believe a tweet will get any kind of attention, but okay, let's see which one is.
And you've had New York Times bestseller, so you can also deal with your tweets, I think. But
yes.
the question I have is, to what extent are faculty responsible for the changing nature of the university? I mean, yes, it's undoubtedly true that there are plenty of young people who enter universities eager to fight the power. But it also, does seem to be the case that there's a feedback mechanism and that professors have some influence on their students. And it also seems from afar, at least, or from occasional discussions with friends who are faculty, that there's a real division on campus, on campuses across America, between those who believe that students are being or should be encouraged to protest the injustices that they see or believe they're seeing, and those who believe that the first duty of students is to learn and to try to think with nuance, as you suggested a minute ago.
First of all, I do think the first duty of students is to learn. I mean, that's ostensibly our purpose on campus. But having said that, I recognize and endorse student protest. I defend student protest. I like youthful exuberance. I've spent my life living among young people. But that doesn't mean, as I said, that we just go along with any kind of protest that we happen, because it's protest, it must be good. No, some protests are wrong-headed. They're ill-informed. They're destructive. They're even work against the cause. I actually don't think that these, I would describe them as literally pro-Hamas protests that are often leavened with, frank antisemitism, help Gazans. I don't think they're actually helping the Palestinian cause. And I think, I'm sure there are many people in Gaza saying, with friends like these, who needs enemies? I think this is, and I think that there have been all these viral videos of students that have been asked, do you understand what you're even saying? And they have no clue. They're just reciting these expressions that they don't really understand. I don't see that as righteous. I don't see that as informed. I don't even see that as helpful, actually. I see that as dangerous. I see people who join a movement that they don't really, out of solidarity rather than conviction. I see that as problematic and inimical to what the purpose of a university is, which is to get people to think. Now, even people who think hard can come to the wrong conclusion. Lamarck, for example, famously in the debate with Darwin, it doesn't mean, or the debate about, Galileo and his opponents. But the principle is that, through debate, through empiricism, through conversation, through open-mindedness, we progressively come closer to the truth. And one of the problems that I have with many of the students, and by the way, a lot of faculty, as you're alluding to, is their censoriousness. They don't want to win the battle of ideas. They want to silence their opponents. And I think that's jejune. It's immature and it's counterproductive. And we see lots of censoriousness, by the way, not just we see also from right wing, we see it in Florida these days with DeSantis is trying to stop faculty from speaking. We see it, there was just an article in Harvard Crimson where a Harvard dean said that university professors who criticize a university should be sanctioned. I mean, this sort of impulse to censor your critics is a dangerous impulse and has absolutely no place at a university. And as you were suggesting, Dan, is shockingly present amongst the faculty as well, who I think have fundamentally misunderstood what the actual purpose of a university and of an education is. If you're so confident in the rectitude of your ideas, win the battle of ideas, engage in the intellectual debate. Don't attempt to silence and prohibit your critics or your opponents from speaking. And we see, in my judgment, and as supported by much evidence from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, which maintains a database, we're seeing far increasing amounts of censoriousness and certainly far too much on university campuses.
Nicholas, one more question. So one of your areas of research has been something called social contagion. And this is something that has been discussed in many different contexts. I think probably most people are familiar with it from the rather remarkable rise in transgenderism among young students in particular, but it is something that gets a lot of attention. And I was wondering how you would interpret the demonstrations that we saw across the country, because, compared to 60 years ago and the Vietnam demonstrations, the U.S. isn't really involved in this issue in the same sort of way in Gaza. It's true that the Biden administration has certainly provided lots of support to Israel, a close ally that experienced enormous loss and trauma, and we can certainly debate whether the Israelis have gone too far or not, but Israel is still 5,000 miles away from the US or more, and it is just kind of astonishing how quickly this all happened, and I'm wondering if your research offers any insights into this remarkable development.
Well, the background for your question is, yes, I've spent the last 20 or 30 years studying human social interactions and trying to understand the evolutionary origins and the modern day functions of the way we connect to each other, whether that's we love each other, we befriend each other, we form these face-to-face social networks, we form groups. We have all of these properties that natural selection endowed us with, even though we reside in a modern world with, modern technologies. And one of those phenomena that we manifest is social contagion. The fact that we tend to copy each other, often blindly. And there's certain interesting evolutionary reasons for this, like why we humans might do that. The basic idea is that you use other people are good proxies for what fits in this environment. So, it's a natural impulse to copy fellow members of our species. It's generally speaking, it's beneficial, but it gets us into serious trouble as well. And the other thing that we do is we've also evolved this capacity for in-group favoritism, which is we prefer our own group and revile what we consider to be the outgroups, the other groups. And this is a very dispiriting feature of our humanity, that human beings, all human beings of all kinds, everywhere in the world, from time immemorial, have had this tendency. And it can also get us into trouble. It has some advantages. There's some interesting ideas about how our capacity to cooperate with each other, this beautiful, wonderful capacity we have to be generous and altruistic, actually may be deeply connected to our ability to draw distinctions between us and them. And the reason is that it's much easier to be nice to just us than to everyone. And so we have evolved this capacity as not just for social contagion that I mentioned, but also for in-group favoritism. And this, which has wonderful qualities, but also can get us into trouble. And we're seeing this on campus as well, and in many of the modern problems that we face. There's this conversation goes back over 100 years. People have been talking about in-groups and out-groups, but there's a big difference between I love my group and I'm indifferent to everyone else versus I love my group and everyone else should be put into ovens, right? That's and that last step, it's unclear if it's actually necessary to hate the other in order to love yourself. I think it's possible to just love your own group and, let's say, at least be minimally indifferent to others. And so we're seeing right now, both with respect to in-group bias and with respect to social contagion, which are natural features of human beings, we're seeing kind of the steroid versions of those in ways that I think are, which has always happened, but we're seeing a kind of a special bout of it right now in ways that are certainly harming our campuses, but also, I think, our broader society.
And the last question for you, because Laura's been very patient, we want to get to her. Do you think that social media has played a particular role in turbocharging this phenomenon?
I think in some ways, yes. I think it's very important for people. My feeling about the social media is it's what I call, it's the same but different. And just as a little toy anecdote, if you had asked my Greek grandmother, born in southern Greece 100 years ago, how many friends she had when she was an 11-year-old girl, she would have said, I had 1 or 2 best friends and 4 or 5 of us girls hung out together. And if you ask my daughter Lena, when she was 11, the same question, even though she had an iPhone in her pocket, she would have given you the same answer. I have 1 or 2 best friends and there are 4 or 5 of us girls and we hang out together. So the invention of this iPhone technology and social media there's something fundamental about human sociality that is unchanged, right? That our desire for friendship, our capacity to have a certain number of friends, to track a certain number of friends, these are unchanged. Our fundamentally monogamous nature, by the way, is also unchanged by these technologies, even though we have dating apps that give us many opportunities to find lots of partners. And many people use those apps. There's nothing wrong with it. But, you know, we, in the end, most of us have one partner. And so there are these fundamental features of human social interaction which have not been changed by social media. But there are others that are modified and have caused or contributed to the kind of problems you mentioned. And that's because these social media are grafted onto these ancient proclivities that we have and exploit them. You know, so our curiosity about what other people around us are doing, our desire to go with the crowd, which is innate, these technologies sort of exploit that for the monetary gain of the firms, and satisfy these needs that we have, give us these little dopamine hits, but I think exacerbate some of the problems that we've been seeing. Yes. I guess what I was trying to say is that I don't think we can blame it all on social media. There are parts that haven't changed and some parts that have.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Laura, as I said, you've been very patient. So I'll just toss you the softball. What's the political significance of the demonstrations? And I would just ask you to look at it from both sides, because it certainly seems like it has become catnip for the right, which you know, is vilifying people who are often out there demonstrating with a passionate sense of right and wrong. And, you know, I think most of us think that that should happen, as Nicholas said. And then on the other side, you know, what does this do to, what does this look like in the fall? I know that no one can predict. I'll preempt you there, but we'll ask you to predict nonetheless.
Anyway.
Perfect. Well, you're correct. No one can predict. And the political consequences, they're a little bit difficult to say in some ways. So what I wanted to walk you through was a few slides to indicate that young people do feel quite differently about this conflict than older people, but then to kind of put it in context, because I don't think it's the be all end all for young people when it comes to foreign policy priorities. It may not even be the be all end all for older Americans when it comes to ranking across lots of different priorities that we've asked about. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of the data from surveys we did in February and April, and then we can talk a little bit about what it means for the election. Just to caveat, we did a nationally representative survey in February, so things may have changed. This does feel like a fast evolving conflict, but we wanted to understand, injecting a little nuance and giving people the opportunity to not know, as we talked about from Theo's remarks earlier. Some people don't know about this issue, and you can see some of these bars stop way short of 100 because we let people have that viewpoint. But basically, we asked people to indicate whether or not they have sympathy entirely with the Israeli people, more with the Israeli people, equally with both, etc., for the Palestinian people, or sympathy with neither. And you can see that younger people stand out when it comes to their sympathies. They're significantly more likely to have sympathy for the Palestinian people than older Americans. And when you draw your eye to the right side of this screen, just among Democrats, young Democrats in particular really stand out. Almost half of Democrats under the age of 30 side more with the Palestinian people, have more sympathies for the Palestinian people. That's not the case when it comes to younger Republicans, who still do have more sympathy with the Israeli people. Even if you don't ask people essentially to choose between them, you allow them to have favorable views of both sides, which is what these questions were. We see that among those under 30, more people have favorable views of the Palestinian people than the Israeli people. And the gap is particularly wide among young Democrats. It's also important to note, especially as we think about echo chambers like TikTok, that's gotten a lot of attention. This was true in 2022 and 2019 as well. We have a trend, and the change has been significant, particularly with young people becoming less favorable towards the Israeli people. But we already saw a gap in views among the youngest groups in 2019 when we started asking this particular question. We also did want to inject some nuance into this debate to give people the opportunity to say that they see the validity for one side or the other fighting, or both, but also to talk about the acceptability of the way they're fighting. And we see that when it comes to young people, fewer actually see Israel's reasons for fighting Hamas as valid than older people. But the The differences really come when it comes to whether or not the way Israel is carrying out its response to Hamas's October 7th attack was either acceptable or unacceptable. You can see that among the 18 to 29-year-old group by more than a 2-to-1 margin, more people called it unacceptable than acceptable. There are differences when it comes to the acceptability and validity of Hamas, but those are actually much narrower. And young people are more likely to say they don't know on almost all of these questions that we asked when given kind of the explicit opportunity to do so. But what does this mean for Biden? Well, one thing we know is that Americans are somewhat divided, with large shares not being sure how Joe Biden is handling this issue. But when it comes to age differences, younger people are much more likely to say that Joe Biden is favoring Israelis too much. We asked this in February, but we also asked it in December. And the only change between December and February was young people being more likely to say that Biden was favoring Israelis too much. We're about to ask it again, so I'll be curious to see whether or not there have been more changes. But younger people are much more likely than older people to essentially say he's striking the wrong tone here and he's doing it in a pro-Israel direction. But what does that mean when it comes to specific policies? Young Americans do not want to be providing military aid to help Israel. But I think interestingly, they're not actually more likely to want the US to provide humanitarian aid to help Palestinian civilians in Gaza. And actually, they're more likely to say the US should play no role in negotiating a diplomatic solution to the war than to say they should play a major role. So comparing this to other issues, we do know that Americans view this particular conflict as somewhat more personally important to them than 2 other conflicts we asked about. So this is Americans as a whole, not by age group. So this is a slightly more personally important conflict. But interestingly, all of these conflicts are more important for older Americans than younger Americans. There is one interesting aside here, though, which is on that bottom row. If you look at the green dot, the war between Israel and Hamas is the only conflict that those under 30, that more than half of them say is personally important to them. So there is a kind of an interesting age difference when it comes to this one being personally important. But when it comes to national interests, all 3 of these conflicts are seen in a similar light by Americans of all ages, and all of them are seen as relatively more important by older people than by younger people. Contextualizing it even further, in April, we asked about 22 specific foreign policy priorities. The top ones for Americans writ large are things like protecting the US from terrorist attacks, reducing the flow of illegal drugs into our country, preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction. In fact, finding a solution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians or supporting Israel are relatively low foreign policy priorities for Americans as a whole. Even if you look just among those under 30, none of these rate above the top 9 for Americans under 30, and supporting Israel is the last priority. But even finding a solution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is not a top priority for young people when it comes to a comparison with, say, combating global climate change. So this is an important conflict for people, particularly personally, not necessarily distinctive when it comes to national policy priorities, and it's not a top national priority. And those were just 22 foreign policy priorities. It's important to note when we think about the election or we think about what people truly want the president to be focusing on, that when it comes to whether or not people want Biden to focus more on domestic policy or foreign policy priority, most people say domestic policy, and there's no age difference on this at all. Younger people are as likely to say that the top priority for Biden should be domestic, not foreign policy priority. So the overall takeaway, I think, is that while Americans under 30 do feel quite differently, they don't necessarily think that this should be our top priority or is necessarily the voting issue as they kind of go forward into the fall. It's hard to say what it'll mean, though, as you preempted me with.
Well, I was giving you an escape hatch there, but so a few questions. Polling is great, but it's difficult sometimes to gauge depth of conviction, depth of commitment on particular issues, and I'm just wondering if, in your work, you can glean any impressions on that particular issue. And I guess what I'm really saying is, can you guess if the election were held today, how many people who might have otherwise, young people who might otherwise have voted for Biden wouldn't? I mean, can you, foreign policy is always a low priority outside of wartime for the United States. So I'm curious if how you make heads or tails of this.
Yeah, you're right that it's difficult to gauge the depth of conviction. That's one of the reasons we ask personal importance versus national importance on those same three issues. But while we can tell that younger people say it's more personally important, the war in Israel, the war between Israel and Hamas, and some of these other issues, you're right that I can't tell someone who said very important whether or not they answered the survey with the top category or they joined the demonstration. We can't distinguish that easily without more kind of qualitative data. In terms of what it means for whether or not people are going to stay home, I think it's hard to say, and is going to be very, it's going to come down to what the two candidates can create as wedge issues, because it's not clear to me based on our data historically or anything recently that people think Trump is better on this issue. In fact, I think probably most people who have a pro-Palestinian kind of direction are more likely to think Trump is worse on this issue for what they believe in. So then it comes down to, do you want to stay home or do you want to differentiate because you think that your interests are better represented by Biden, even if you disagree with his take? So all this to say, very difficult to parse out, but I do think that for at least some people, maybe who have a little bit more of the nuance, or who can see the differentiation between the two candidates, that could play a role.
So let me just shift from young voters to Muslim voters. If the past is prologue, Jewish voters are going to stick with Joe Biden in large numbers. If I understand a lot of Pew survey work and others, Jews will continue to vote probably 70% plus or minus for a Democratic candidate, and don't view the issue in Israel as being a decisive one for their voting. But among the chattering classes, there is enormous concern that Muslim voters in the United States, and particularly those in Dearborn and Detroit, Michigan, ground zero as far as swing states are concerned, that they are taking a sort of pox on both their houses approach because of their disgust at what's going on in Gaza. Do you have any data on that issue?
Yeah, we can't speak to state estimates at all, but we did have an oversample of both Jews and Muslims in this February survey. So we were able to look at opinions among those groups. And we did find one interesting data point among Muslims, which is favorability of Biden and favorability of Trump is the same among Muslim voters. It's about a third. This stands in contrast to in the past when usually views of the Republican presidents have often been more negative than the Democratic presidents. So yes, as I mentioned, if you can differentiate between the candidates, perhaps that will play a role. From our read of the Muslim data, and we did not have a lot of questions that got at Trump, there was not a ton of daylight between the views of the two candidates among the Muslim sample. That said, this was—
how does that compare with 2020?
We did not have a directly comparable measure then, but views of Biden were much more positive overall than they were of Trump. And in fact, generally speaking, Muslim views of Trump have been quite negative historically, particularly kind of in the context of the Muslim ban.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
The salience of this issue in the U.S. is actually kind of remarkable, and I'm wondering if you or if any of our guests have any suggestion. It is obviously a very kinetic thing right now. There is a war going on. The images are appalling, but there are, for example, at this point, many more Asian Americans in the United States than there are Jewish Americans or Muslim Americans, and yet the salience of and there's also a broad-based feeling that that the global conflict now, or the potential global conflict, is with China, and yet there is this endless fascination with the Middle East. And I'm just wondering if anyone can venture a guess. I mean, for me, it's instinctive. Yes, of course, we would be more interested in the Middle East. We've been engaged in the Middle East for so long. But it is interesting how much people view this as a personal issue, and relatedly, how this has seemed to ignite so much anti-Semitism in a country in which, as Pew Research has shown, Jews are more accepted now than at any time in American history. And indeed, I believe it was a Pew report that said Americans would be more likely to vote for a Jew for president than for any other religious, someone from any other religious group, which was staggering to me. And I'm just wondering if anyone wants to venture a guess. How did we get to this completely paradoxical situation? Don't all speak up at once.
I mean, there's certainly differences depending on whether we're talking about at a college like Stanford or writ large nationally. These schools are not representative in many, many ways. I will say, I don't know how much I can contribute to this, but I can say, as probably the person on this talk who talks the most frequently with the most number of young people, that there really is not knowledge of like Ukraine. There is not a lot of understanding of what's happening in Sudan. Nobody has heard of Nagorno-Karabakh. I think the unique focus of this, probably in large part because the US has been such a key partner to Israel, is worth looking at. But it's also, I think it's become sort of a Rorschach test for how you view the world. Is it a simple fight between oppressor and oppressed? If you're talking about colonizer and colonized, a lot of people who ascribe to that belief system about the world, about colonizing, sort of see Israel as like a modern day version of a fight that has already been fought many times in the past, and now they have the opportunity to be in the middle of history, but on the fighting side of the colonized. So that's part of it. But as to the larger issue of identity, I mean, at least at Stanford, certainly Judaism has not been a settled identity for a long time. I came to Stanford last year, and I went back to my parents at Thanksgiving break, and I said, guys, Stanford is anti-Semitic. This was a year before October 7th. They said, what? No, I mean, it's a modern university. How could it possibly be anti-Semitic? I was like, yeah. Someone asked me the first week I was at Stanford, why are all Jews so rich? Later in the quarter, there were two of us who were sort of Jewish in my dorm, and the other kid talked about being Jewish for the first time. And in the middle of the night, someone in our dorm scrawled a bunch of swastikas on his door and put an image of Hitler. And this was, 10 months before October 7th. Wow, so, as true as it is that like I grew up in a place where I did not feel Judaism was like, or being Jewish was at all a salient identity. In a lot of places, I guess it's still pretty different, including Stanford.
I just want to remind our viewers, send in those questions. I would love to put them to our guests, and so please do put them in the Q&A section of the Zoom platform. Nicholas, did you have something you wanted to add on that one?
No, I just was stunned by that, the Theo's anecdotes from his freshman year. And, I think anti-Semitism is always a bad sign for any society. And I think those types of, we can write off one-off kinds of things, or an occasional, there's always, as he said, going to be some jerk, some ignorant person, some bigot who is going to revile some group and do something stupid. But, when they begin to add up, I think we are being very foolish if we put our head in the sand. And, at Yale, when there were the protests at Yale, I had no, personally, I had no problem with them putting up tents, for example. I see that as a protest. I had no problem with them. Some of the students were playing pro-Hamas rap songs. I completely disavow the content of those songs, but I see that as free expression and needs to be defended. I I think these were wrong-headed and incorrect beliefs about what was actually happening, but much of the protests, I think, needed to be defended. But then you saw really vile things like students that were visibly Jewish, for example, very conservative, dressed in a conservative manner, and other students block their movement through campus. This absolutely cannot stand. I mean, we cannot have a situation in which people are singled out because of who they appear to be, and then prohibited from the enjoyment of the common space that we have. So it's one thing for you to carry a poster, however ill-informed, and protest what you're saying, and it's quite another for you to interfere with the rights of your fellow students to enjoy the campus. And also, it's one thing for you to play a pro-Hamas rap song in an open space, and it's quite another for you to put a swastika on Theo's colleague's door, right? The former is free expression. The latter is harassment, is a threat, right? And this is a distinction which is kind of well understood in First Amendment law. You know, the Nazis can march through Skokie, Illinois, but they cannot stop in front of my house. There's a big difference between those two things. And then Martin Luther King talked about this too, you know, like the KKK could burn these crosses on public lands, but they couldn't burn one on his front lawn, right? I mean, there's a very big difference between these things. And this is completely lost on many campuses and among many students right now. You know, that Theo, as a freshman at Stanford in 2023, would have a situation in which his peer, someone is putting swastikas on his door, is repugnant, and it's not just a one-off thing. You know, we're seeing quite a few of these things, and they begin to add up. And I think we need to take it very seriously and ask ourselves questions as to how and why we see this type of resurgent acceptability of this very ancient hatred of anti-Semitism.
Nicholas, to kind of follow up on.
Just to remind people, like during the pandemic, I wrote a book about the pandemic. During the Black Death, Jews were falsely accused of being responsible for the Black Death, and were put to death in horrible ways in great numbers, right? I mean, we're talking, you know, 500 years ago, anti-Semitic tropes, you know, were called to explain, and again, a totalizing ideology, the Black Death. Pope Clement VI, by the way, in an astonishing use of logic, said, if it were true that the Jews were responsible for the Black Death, then it would be righteous that we killed them. But look, he said, the Jews are dying in great numbers just like us from this infection. They can't be responsible for this. And, you know, if the use of logic were possible in the Pope 500 years ago, I mean, surely we're capable of reasoning on our campuses today to recognize, you know, the appeal, the horrible appeal of this, you know, ancient hatred.
Nicholas, what are universities going to do? What is higher education going to do to strengthen the commitment to free speech? Because it really does seem like it has gone out the window to a large extent. You know, I worked at a university down the road from you, and there were a number of alums who were really interested in supporting free speech. And then, you know, and in some cases it was very positive. And then in some cases, administrators at the university, you know, canceled events that were controversial. And what we're seeing now is that, as to use your phrase from before, on steroids, that impulse. And it does seem like administrators are often, or university leaders are often not committed to free speech. And, you know, one of the interesting things that you posted a while ago was a poll from Harvard that found that professors were saying that, you know, one of the biggest impediments that they face to their work as teachers was the intolerance of students. I think over 51% or something like 51% of the professors there were saying that. So it does seem like there's a real crisis in that regard. And I don't expect that the resolution to that will come quickly, but do you have a sense that there are changes in the works, and if so, what should they be?
I have been shocked. This is not something that I've been concerned about just in the last 10 years. This is a commitment to free expression on campus is something that's concerned me for 20 years. And it's been getting worse and worse over the last 20 years. And it's so illogical to me that it's hard for me to even to understand. Like, I understand that human beings don't want to hear things that they don't like to hear, and they would just as soon silence their opponents. But you would think that a university would be a place where that seductive ideology would be immediately rejected, where everyone would understand the dangerousness of that belief system, and where everyone would be committed to the widest possible free expression. And yet we see that that's not the case, that there's a lot of censoriousness among the students and amongst the faculty. Large numbers of faculty at elite institutions are quite happy with disinviting speakers, with the heckler's veto, with deplatforming people, with saying that people don't have the right to speak, conflating really sloppy thinking. Like, I might invite someone to speak on campus I disagree with. Just because I invite someone to speak on campus doesn't mean I agree with them. This idea doesn't seem to register with lots of people. It's astonishing to me. I might invite someone I disagree with to argue with them, or maybe to test the merits of my own ideas. And therefore, I am now seen as complicit or being a party to their beliefs just because I've invited them. I mean, you'd be astonished at how many people have this type of sloppy thinking. I alluded to a bunch of essays that colleagues of mine at top universities have been publishing over the years, which just reveal this type of thinking. This is a settled matter. How could you, for example, on gender identity, this is settled. How could you allow anyone to question this? That doesn't make any. That's what universities are for, is to question things. So yes, I'm very worried. I don't think it's getting better yet, and I don't know when the tide will turn. And this is a wedge issue. I think poking fun at woke colleges, I think, is a winning wedge issue for the right wing in our country, because I think there are many center left and liberals who for whom this is an appealing topic. And there's no downside for the Republicans on Congress to call university presidents and humiliate them. There's absolutely no downside for them. This is a very strong wedge issue, and I think could play a small role in the next election. Yeah. Even though most people care about what's happening at major universities, I agree with that. But the sort of, when it's framed as wokeness, I think lots of people care.
Yeah. Theo, are you seeing any kind of backlash? I mean, is there a revival of the sensible center that is trying to kind of restore some measure of reason on campus, or are you just all getting out for summer break?
Wouldn't hold your hopes up. I mean, there's certainly, so the protesters very briefly seized the president's office at Stanford maybe 2 weeks ago, and in the process defaced our historic main quad with messages that included death to America, kill cops. There was a war memorial that was spray painted with "fuck America," but the C was instead the KKK. I don't think that was tremendously popular on campus. It resulted in millions of dollars of damages. By the way, our historic main quad will never be the same. Some of the damage is irreparable, which to me is an incredible shame. It resulted in, obviously not just property damage, but the arrest of the 11 people inside protesting. So I don't think people were super fond of that. Yet, I wouldn't say that their actual opinions have shifted because of it. I think the fact that people are willing to acknowledge consistently, the fact that people have been able to acknowledge one or two transgressions has not allowed them to recognize broader systemic issues within their own movements. it's a lot easier to criticize your enemy than it is to recognize issues of intolerance within your own in-group, which obviously is, not something limited to this protest. So I'm not entirely hopeful that the real central issue, which is how we're treating each other and how we think it's acceptable now to conduct political discourse, has had any meaningful shift.
Yeah. Laura, I just wanted to ask you if you wanted to comment on Nicholas's remark about this being a wedge issue. I mean, if you listen to a number of sort of Freedom Caucus members in Congress, the far right, this issue does come up a lot about wokeness and about American universities and colleges being kind of enemy encampments. And I don't know what the data is on that, but it certainly does at an anecdotal level seem to be a big deal.
I think it is a big deal. And a different team at the center just put out a great report on culture war issues in the 2024 election that I can post it into the chat in a minute, and it's great. But beyond just the specific culture war issues where you definitely see diverging attitudes about all of the kind of woke issues you might expect, we actually have seen just a rapid decrease in trust and kind of favorable views among Republicans of institutions of higher education. So the very concept of college or universities at this point is polarized and has been polarizing quite rapidly, where they're less likely to see the benefits of it. They're less likely to have positive views of their impact on society and things of that sort. Changing really over the last 10 years quite dramatically. So colleges and universities in general are an increasingly polarized topic for the electorate.
One thing I would add, by the way, is that we're seeing decline in belief in all kinds of institutions: the police, the army, the Supreme Court, journalism, universities. And I believe some of that relates to the post-pandemic loss of confidence in institutions. And this is something I wrote about in 2020 at the start of the pandemic. It's very common after serious epidemics for the populace to lose confidence in the institutions. And famously, this happened after the Black Death, because the doctors were revealed to be incompetent. They couldn't stop the Black Death. The priests were clearly incompetent. They couldn't stop the Black Death. The government was clearly incompetent. It couldn't stop the Black Death. So many people trace the emergence of capitalism, the Reformation, the rise of science, to this sort of tearing down of confidence in institutions after the Black Death. And actually, even since the last 500 years, not just to use the Black Death as a benchmark, for many other episodes in history where there have been major epidemics, there's been a kind of crisis of confidence in institutions. So I think we have what I would call an acute on chronic phenomenon. There was sort of declining already, as Laura said earlier, confidence in some of these institutions. And I think that's been accelerated, by the way. And I think the January 6th protest is another example. Like the BLM movement on the left, I think was prompted in part or sort of abetted or facilitated by the changes of the epidemic. And I think the January 6th insurrection on the right also in some sense was prompted by the same kind of pandemic-induced anxiety about what direction is our society taking in, what do our leaders know, are they really telling us the truth, and so on. So I think there's a more thoroughgoing. If we get another problem in our society right now that is quite concerning to me.
So I just had one last question for you, Nicholas, and that is, watching this from afar, it seems as if there was a trajectory on the part of university leadership for dealing with the problem that began with maybe an awful lot of tolerance of over-the-line protesting, that is, protesting that was interfering with the lives of other students, and that was, leading to some of the kinds of excesses that Theo has mentioned, and that as time went by and there was more and more of an outcry from wealthy alums in particular, but alumni in general, that and after kind of the disaster of the three university presidents who appeared in Congress, there was a kind of change in approach, and then suddenly it seems like a lot of university presidents decided that it was the trustees and the alums who they were serving, and not so much the students anymore. And this led, in at least one case, down the road from you at Dartmouth, to the president essentially coming down super hard with, lots of armored vehicles and whatnot, after a day after the encampments were told to disperse. I'm curious whether this trajectory sounds realistic to you, or this description, and whether you think it may be the harbinger of a new look in university leadership.
I think being a university president is a very difficult job at any time, and I think it's getting worse and worse, honestly. I also think it's important to realize that the decision to call police is a difficult decision, but the president is not responsible for what the police do. The state police are independent actors. That's why you need to be careful before you call them, because you can't tell them what to do once you call them. I think in situations in which you have, like Theo was talking about, the very major we're not talking about chalking, where you write in chalk on the sidewalk and it gets washed away with water. We're talking about destroying property of great value and great symbolic meaning. And I think that your right to swing your hands ends at my face. I think we can't easily accept that kind of lawlessness. So I think so I guess I would say I think it's difficult to navigate how to handle it. I think one of the reasons university presidents have had so much difficulty is not these particular individuals, except in the case of Claudine Gay, where I think she was hypocritical herself.
Right.
Yeah, she was hypocritical. I think Liz McGill had not been hypocritical. I think Liz McGill had tried to act in a way,
right?
Yeah, tried to act in a way that protected free expression. I think she had made the call to allow the Palestinian Rights WRITES festival to go on, and I think she had been consistent. Whereas I think Claudine Gay, as dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, had acted in a way, either in a censorious way or in a way indifferent to the rights of unpopular people to express themselves on campus. So she could hardly get in front of Congress and say, well, we're going to allow this, anti-Semitic expression, whereas we previously wouldn't allow all kinds of other expression. It looked hypocritical. It was hypocritical. So I think if universities had been consistent in what are called time, place, and manner restrictions, in other words, restricting expression without reference to the content of the expression, I think they would have been in a much better situation. And so this goes for protest as well. If we tolerate minor transgressions on campus all the time. I think we have to. We're not the religious police in Iran. We allow students to occasionally misbehave, and we look the other way, but not when it's too extreme or sustained, right? Then I think we have to, and we can't pick favorites. We can't allow the students, to do defacement of this kind, but then crack down on defacement of this other kind. And I think that's part of the problem that has arisen, is the inconsistency and the lack of probity in how we interpret free expression rules on campus.
Well, and it's a small point, but it is very quickly worth noting that, the presidents that you both mentioned, the president that I reported on at Stanford, almost all of these are very new in their head, role. They have not had control of their institutions as they've been building toward this moment. And now they're thrust to the forefront, asked to serve as emblems of these universities that have behaved in ways that they may or may not have supported in the past. It's a really tricky position to be in, certainly. I definitely echo you on that.
Yeah, but I think, Theo, I thought about that too. Many of these presidents were new in their roles. It's true. But one thing they could have done is they could have been honest. They could have said, look, I'm new in this job. I think this is an important university. These are important principles. I repudiate these previous actions for these reasons. Here are my reasons why I think these things are wrong, and here's how we're going to handle it going forward and in my administration. I think that kind of honesty would be tremendously helpful. And furthermore, I think many of the new presidents now are, to their credit, as soon as they come to office, are trying to cut the Hydra's head and sear it by saying, you know, my administration is going to be recommitted to institutional neutrality, is recommitting itself to time, place, and manner restrictions, and so on, to try to get ahead of being put in the position of looking hypocritical and being bound by decisions of their predecessors.
Okay, well, I think we should probably wrap it up there. I want to thank Laura, Theo, and Nick for a really interesting and somewhat troubling conversation. But, you know, I guess the first step to recovery is airing all these issues. Theo, all I can say is I hope your last 2 years are a lot more calm than your first two were, although that may have a negative effect on your literary career. But I do hope that college quiets down a bit and that you can both enjoy your classes and college life. Nicholas, I'm going to support you for a university presidency, which may be the last thing you want. And Laura, I'm going to promise not to ask you any more unanswerable questions. I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to thank all of our audience for joining us as well. This is, in fact, the very last event of our semester. And so I will not do what I usually do and name the next 3 things we're going to do. I'm going to go quietly into the night, but I do hope that you will keep an eye out for our newsletter and social media and other publicity on the events that we will be presenting in the fall. And of course, Nicholas has already been here, but all 3 participants are more than welcome to come and talk about all these issues here as well. So thank you. It looks like it's a beautiful day in Vermont. I can't tell what kind of day it is in California, but I want to wish you all the best. And thanks again to the audience. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.